The Honourable Peter Dunn.
Mr Speaker, may I raise a point of order at the outset to seek the leave of the House to table a petition that was presented to me in my last days as the Associate Minister from the Manarewa community, signed by 3,533 people opposing the opening of a new legal high store in downtown Manarewa.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there any objection? There is no objection. You can table that.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable Peter Dunn.
Before the member goes on, not to be unhelpful, can we just inquire as to the process now, whether that is referred anywhere or not? Normally when petitions are tabled, they're referred off to a...
No, it's just he only asked for it to be tabled, and maybe in the course of the member's speech he might like to comment about that, but he only asked for it to be tabled, and that's what leave is granted for. The Honourable Peter Dunn.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm delighted to speak on the second reading of the Psychoactive Substances Bill. I must confess that the debate this afternoon is taking place in slightly different circumstances than those I had originally imagined would occur when we talked about this bill proceeding at this time. But nonetheless, I'm very pleased with the work that the Select Committee has done in terms of its consideration of the legislation and the bill that has emerged that looks like enjoying the unanimous support of this House. Mr Speaker, the reason I sought to table... Oh, I'm sorry. I should have known better, perhaps, than to presume that the ACT Party would be in line with public opinion. But the reason I sought to table this bill, the reason I sought to table this petition, very simply, was because it is indicative of the wide range of community concern up and down New Zealand about the impact of psychoactive substances being sold through dairies and various other outlets with impunity by some very irresponsible retailers. And the Manarewa example was one, and I know the member for Manarewa and Dr Calder had been very vigorous in their local efforts, and I was pleased to receive this petition. Mr Speaker, I want to correct a myth that has been circulating about this bill. It did not actually arise as a result of the Law Commission's recommendations. In fact, the genesis of this bill came at the UN Convention on Narcotic Drugs meeting in Vienna in early 2011. And it became clear to me in discussions at that meeting that the British government at that stage was seeking to move down this path. I thought that was a particularly good idea, and as we were developing our interim regime, tasked officials in the Ministry of Health with finding out all we could about what the Brits were proposing and then developing a regime that met our needs. Along the way, the Law Commission made its recommendations. The irony is, Mr Speaker, when I went back to Vienna in March this year for the follow-up discussions, the British were curious to know where we were because they were actually stalled in their efforts. In other words, we picked up their idea from 2 years ago, had the legislation almost before Parliament at that stage. They were still working through their internal bureaucracy to get to that point and were asking us with some envy what progress we were making and how would this occur. Mr Speaker, I acknowledge the comments by both the Minister and the previous Speaker about my own role, and I thank them for that. It is no secret that I was frustrated at the time that it was taking to get this legislation into the House, and I'm delighted now that we are through the process and the bill looks like passing fairly quickly. This is world-breaking legislation. And the reason is because it tackles the problem in quite a lateral way. It simply says to the manufacturers and suppliers of these pernicious substances, you prove they are low risk, and if you can, we will let you sell them. A very simple proposition. Every other country, the Australians, the Irish, the French, the Americans, the Russians, the British, many of the European nations with whom I've spoken, have all been playing the same game of trying to define what is a psychoactive substance and how you ban it. And there have been many variations on that theme, and all have come to the point of saying it's too difficult, what is a way through? So New Zealand is being looked on as world leading in this regard, and if this legislation is, as I believe it will be, successful, then we can expect to see that model picked up and implemented right around the world. Because this issue is not just one for this country. It's one that's affecting every jurisdiction. And when you look at the debates that are going on in those countries and you follow the tenor of the argument, it's exactly the same as we've had here over the last couple of years or so. Mr Speaker, one of the great frustrations also that I experienced during my time as the Associate Minister was the anger of communities who wanted to see action, and a sense that they had often reflected in the comments I would get about, why don't you just simply ban these things? Well, for various reasons, that's not possible. Their chemical composition is such that these things are almost indefinable. You ban one substance and one element is changed and the same substance reappears. In my time as Minister, we banned 30-odd different substances, over 50-odd products, and we were vigorous in doing so. But you can only go so far down that path, and that is why this legislation becomes vital and necessary. And I make no apology for the fact that we will set a deliberately high bar. I make no apology for the fact that those who want to go through the process will pay an exorbitant fee to get there. There are huge proceeds involved from this trade, and I think it's only fair and reasonable to expose those people to a very rigorous standard of testing and a very rigorous process before we even get to the point where they get onto the market. Now let me deal with one of the great red herrings of this debate, the animal testing issue. There was never any intention, ever, to embark upon a program of animal testing associated with these products. Never, ever any intent. What happened was simply this. If the member would just give me the courtesy of some silence, I'll explain to him what actually happened. Late last year, an Official Information Act request was lodged with the Ministry of Health for a whole range of papers relating to this new regime. One of the papers was a paper prepared by Dr. Leo Shep of the National Poisons Centre in Dunedin. Dr. Shep has done a huge amount of work in this area, but is at one end of the spectrum in terms of the debate. He's a purist. I acknowledge that. He's an exceptional toxicologist, but he's a purist. He produced a paper that was headed Report to the New Zealand Government on Animal Testing. It was his initiative. Unfortunately, when we sought to release that batch of papers, I didn't check the title page. What appeared in the Sunday Star Times was, here's an official report to the New Zealand Government recommending animal testing. It was an unsolicited piece of advice. That was why I ruled out very immediately the LD50 test, and that was why I worked with the Select Committee through the Expert Advisory Committee to make sure that the instances where animal testing might be even a possibility were minimised and reduced. But I say to the House, it was never the intention. Mr. Banks, if you ask a question, it's customary to let the person answer it before you come back with the next one. Mr. Speaker, I'm just in the process of explaining to the yabbering creature to my left the answer to his question. It was never the intention to embark upon an animal testing regime as part of this legislation. Can I explain again? This is becoming like a routine. It was never the intention to embark upon any form of animal testing. The Expert Advisory Committee has given very clear advice to the Select Committee, and the reality is that a lot of the stuff, and I'm still getting emails today in Cyrillic script in various different languages from around the world from people saying, don't test psychoactive substances on dogs. Mr. Speaker, that was never the intention. It was never going to happen. The member says, will it happen? Can I say it was never going to happen? Dear me, that you can only go so far in terms of legislating for... Mr. Speaker, can I say again to the member, it was never the intention. How many words does he need to explain it? And I'm not going to... Look, Mr. Mr. Speaker, that is absolute ridiculous nonsense. And if the member for Epsom wants to go out there and oppose this legislation, he can answer to his communities, he can answer to the parents, to all of the people affected by it, and Mr. Speaker, he will be the one who will be reviled as the person out of step with public opinion. And Mr. Speaker, I say to the ACT Party, if it wants to show any form of relevance, it will grow up, it will respect the conscience of New Zealanders on this issue, and it will support this legislation. Mr. Speaker, he's welcome to be on a limb. It'll be a very lonely place, I assure him. The bulk of New Zealanders want to see this legislation passed immediately. It will be, and I acknowledge the support of the government, I acknowledge the support of other parties who take an approach in this particular legislation that is beneficial. Mr. Speaker, this is the opportunity to make huge progress. The world is watching us, and I think this Parliament will do not only the people of New Zealand and the young people of New Zealand a huge service in passing this legislation, but it will set a standard that other nations will follow and hopefully working collectively at an international level, we can start to turn back the clock on this particular issue.
Louisa Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my pleasure to take